What is unfolding in the Persian Gulf is not being misread by accident. It is being framed with intent. The surface narrative describes a containment operation, a blockade, a controlled application of pressure. None of that survives contact with the actual operational picture. What exists instead is a managed illusion built to maintain domestic belief in control, while the underlying system behaves in a very different way. Inside any high-level strategic apparatus, there is always a gap between action and explanation. That gap is where legitimacy is manufactured. In this case, the gap has widened beyond normal bounds. Either the decision-makers understand the limits of what they are doing and are deliberately obscuring them, or the feedback loops inside the system have degraded to the point where perception and capability no longer align. In both cases, the outcome is the same. The public is being shown a simplified version of events that cannot survive quantitative scrutiny. The Persian Gulf operation is a clear example. On paper, the United States has deployed multiple carrier strike groups, supported by escort vessels and amphibious units. In practice, once you remove the symbolic assets that cannot engage in interdiction operations, you are left with a very small number of ships actually capable of boarding and controlling maritime traffic. Roughly a dozen platforms are being asked to monitor one of the most heavily trafficked energy corridors in the world. That corridor has not slowed in any meaningful way. Since mid-April, between 100 and 200 Iranian-linked vessels have continued moving through the Gulf of Oman and adjacent waters. The ratio between enforcement capacity and traffic volume produces an unavoidable constraint. At best, a fraction of shipments can be intercepted. On most days, the operational disruption is marginal. The geography determines the outcome more than the fleet does. Iranian vessels operate within a narrow legal buffer of territorial waters. Within that zone, they are shielded from direct engagement unless external forces are willing to escalate into a legally and militarily different category of conflict. That threshold has not been crossed. As a result, maritime movement continues inside a predictable envelope of risk. The consequence is straightforward. Energy flows are adapting to enforcement pressure faster than enforcement is adapting to Iranian routing behavior. Oil continues to move because the system is designed for redundancy, and Iran has already monetized a significant portion of its output in advance. Roughly 150 million barrels were positioned in global transit channels under pre-sale arrangements. At prevailing price levels, this translates into tens of billions of dollars already embedded in circulation before any interdiction logic can meaningfully intervene. From a systems perspective, this is the key point. The blockade is not failing in real time. It was structurally incapable of achieving full denial from the outset. Its function is therefore not purely operational. It is also informational. It signals action, produces the appearance of pressure, and sustains a domestic narrative of escalation control. The system is optimized for perception management rather than physical denial. That distinction becomes even clearer when viewed through the legal layer. The conflict has now crossed the 60-day threshold associated with war powers reporting obligations. In theory, this introduces constitutional friction between executive action and legislative oversight. In practice, that friction has historically been absorbed through procedural flexibility. The war powers framework was never a hard constraint. It functions more as a political instrument than a binding limit. Administrations interpret, reset, or reclassify operational phases to maintain continuity of action while technically satisfying reporting requirements. The result is a legal architecture that appears restrictive but behaves as an extension mechanism for executive decision-making under stress conditions. Current indicators suggest the same pattern is being prepared again. Operational pauses, reclassification of mission phases, or temporal resets sets are all structurally available options. None of them require substantive de-escalation. They only require narrative adjustment. At the same time, the military layer is showing a different signal. Command-level assessments have reportedly raised doubts about the utility of continued air operations. The logic is simple. If the current strike profile has already extracted the available strategic effect, then additional sorties convert into cost accumulation without proportional return. Weapon inventories, logistical depth, and escalation exposure begin to dominate planning assumptions. But parallel to that caution, there is movement in the opposite direction. Special operations assets are being repositioned into the theater at a higher than normal tempo. Units that are typically reserved for narrowly defined contingency roles are now appearing in broader preparatory configurations. This includes both specialized and conventional formations. This matters because it changes the structure of commitment. Air campaigns can be adjusted incrementally. Ground-capable special operations deployments create a different kind of inertia. Once those assets are positioned, institutional logic begins to favor utilization rather than withdrawal. The system develops momentum, not from intent alone, but from logistics, proximity, and sunk cost. At this stage, the metaphor becomes operationally accurate. A mechanism is being assembled that is easier to activate than to stand down. The decision space narrows not because options disappear, but because reversing deployments carries its own strategic cost. There is also an external layer forming around this structure. Signals from major external actors are beginning to register. Diplomatic messaging from Moscow, delivered through high-level channels, indicates explicit concern over further escalation involving Iranian territory. This is not routine signaling. It reflects an assessment that the trajectory is approaching a threshold where third-party interests become directly affected. Such warnings are rarely issued without calculation. In strategic systems, early positioning is often more important than immediate response. It creates a record of intent that can be referenced after escalation occurs. In other words, it is not designed to prevent action. It is designed to structure the narrative after action. Inside the United States decision environment, however, there is a filtering problem. External warnings are processed through pre-existing assumptions about credibility, signaling, and bluff probability. When those assumptions are miscalibrated, the system systematically discounts information that should otherwise alter risk calculations. This is where the structural risk begins to concentrate, not in any single decision point, but in the interaction between operational momentum, legal elasticity, and filtered threat perception. At the same time, the underlying assumption guiding much of the current strategy is that Iranian internal cohesion has degraded under pressure. That assumption treats recent strikes as having produced disorientation within leadership structures. But that interpretation depends heavily on how resilience is defined. What appears as fragmentation from the outside often functions as consolidation under external pressure. Systems with prior experience of sustained conflict tend to reorganize rapidly around threat exposure rather than dissolve under it. That historical pattern is critical because it directly affects how escalation dynamics unfold after initial strikes. What is emerging, therefore, is not a linear pressure campaign, but a multi-layered system in which physical operations, legal frameworks, intelligence assumptions, and external signaling are no longer aligned. Each layer is operating on a slightly different model of reality, and that divergence is where strategic miscalculation becomes possible. The next phase depends on whether these misaligned assumptions are corrected in time or whether they continue to compound under the pressure of operational momentum already in motion. The deeper problem is no longer what is happening in the Persian Gulf. It is what the system believes is happening there. Because once a strategic apparatus locks onto a false or incomplete model of reality, every subsequent action becomes internally consistent but externally unstable. Decisions begin to reinforce the assumption rather than test it. And at this stage, the assumption driving policy is that pressure is accumulating inside Iran faster than it is accumulating inside the United States. That belief is not being generated from direct observation alone. It is being reinforced through filtered intelligence streams, allied assessments, and internal interpretations that prioritize coherence over contradiction. In particular, early battlefield damage assessments and fragmented signals of disruption have been interpreted as systemic paralysis. That interpretation now sits at the center of escalation planning. But the structure inside Iran does not match that model. What external observers interpret as fragmentation is closer to compression. Institutions formed under prolonged conflict conditions do not dissolve under pressure. They tighten. They reduce internal variance. They prioritize continuity of command over deliberation. That is a critical distinction because it changes the entire escalation calculus. In systems terms, this is the difference between a network breaking apart and a network hardening under load. The misread is not accidental. It is historically familiar. Similar analytical frameworks were used in earlier conflicts where early strikes were assumed to produce decision paralysis in adversary leadership. In those cases, the expectation was that precision disruption would shorten conflict duration. Instead, it extended it. The adversary absorbed initial shocks, reorganized command structures, and adapted operational tempo faster than escalation planners anticipated. The pattern is consistent across multiple theaters. Strategic bombing does not reliably produce political collapse. It produces adaptation. It forces distributed decision systems to centralize authority temporarily, then decentralize execution. That shift often increases resilience rather than reducing it. This is where the current trajectory begins to tighten. Because once a campaign moves from air operations into preparation for ground-linked contingencies, the structure of commitment changes. Air power allows reversible signaling. Ground preparation introduces irreversible logistics. Personnel deployment, intelligence mapping, and operational staging create inertia that cannot be easily unwound without political cost. At that point, strategy stops being purely about outcomes. It begins to include exit cost. And exit cost is where escalation traps form. The reported movement of specialized units into theater is not significant in isolation. It becomes significant when combined with the assumption that additional strikes will produce diminishing returns. That combination creates pressure to escalate vertically rather than horizontally. In other words, if one layer of force is assessed as insufficient, the system is incentivized to test the next layer rather than reassess the underlying model. This is how escalation becomes self-propelling without requiring a single centralized decision to expand scope. At the same time, the external environment is tightening in parallel. Energy markets are not reacting to narrative signals. They are reacting to physical disruption. Even partial degradation of shipping efficiency through the Strait of Hormuz introduces friction into a system that is optimized for continuous flow. That friction does not need to become total blockage to generate macroeconomic consequences. It only needs to persist. Once insurance premiums rise, routing shifts, and delivery uncertainty increases, global pricing mechanisms begin to adjust in anticipation rather than reaction. That is where inflationary transmission begins. Not at the point of full disruption, but at the point where disruption becomes structurally credible. This is why the current situation is already producing second-order effects in global markets, even without full escalation into energy infrastructure targeting. The system does not wait for complete breakdown. It prices probability, and probability is now elevated. Inside the strategic decision environment, however, there is a persistent belief that escalation can still be controlled at each incremental stage. That belief rests on the assumption that adversary response curves are linear and predictable. But historical precedent suggests otherwise. Once critical infrastructure or leadership survival is perceived to be at risk, response curves become nonlinear. That is the threshold problem. Below that threshold, deterrence behaves as expected. Above it, deterrence dynamics invert. The cost of restraint becomes higher than the cost of response. At that point, escalation is no longer a choice between options. It becomes a constraint imposed by system logic. This is the part of the model that is often missed in public discourse. The assumption that actors always prefer stability ignores the fact that perceived survival conditions override stability preferences entirely. From that perspective, the current intelligence assumption that Iranian leadership is fragmented becomes strategically dangerous if incorrect. Because if leadership cohesion is actually intact, then deterrence signals will be interpreted as unified pressure rather than disorganizing force. That produces the opposite of the intended effect. It strengthens internal alignment. There is also a structural misalignment in how military feasibility is being interpreted. Tactical success in air campaigns does not automatically translate into strategic leverage. Destroying infrastructure or degrading specific systems can alter capability distribution, but it does not necessarily translate into compliance or political restructuring. This is where historical comparison becomes unavoidable. In previous major conflicts involving sustained aerial campaigns, initial assessments consistently overestimated the correlation between damage and political outcome. In practice, adversaries adjusted by dispersing assets, decentralizing command, and absorbing loss thresholds that external planners had assumed were unsustainable. The result was not collapse, it was endurance. That same dynamic is now reappearing, but with additional complexity introduced by global interdependence. Unlike earlier eras, the economic system absorbing the shock is not regionally contained. It is globally synchronized. Energy flows, shipping routes, insurance mechanisms, and currency pricing are all connected in real time. This means localized escalation does not remain localized. It propagates. A sustained disruption scenario in the Strait of Hormuz, even without full closure, introduces volatility into global supply chains that cannot be isolated geographically. That volatility feeds directly into inflation expectations, interest rate responses, and fiscal stress in multiple economies simultaneously. In systems terms, this is not a regional conflict with global effects. It is a global system absorbing a regional shock in real time.